Now, it's 12 minutes past 11. There's a big public inquiry starting this morning into what's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. More than 2,400 people died in the 1970s and 80s after receiving blood transfusions that had been contaminated with hepatitis C and HIV. 5 Live's Stephen Chittenden is outside the inquiry in Westminster. What's happening today, Stephen?
Well, hundreds of people have gathered here today for the start of the inquiry in the shadow of Westminster Abbey, and they're wearing a pretty blunt colour scheme. A lot of the men are wearing ties in red, yellow and black. A lot of the women are wearing badges and brooches and scarves in those colours, and this is the symbol of the campaign to get an investigation into this. The red is for blood, the yellow is for hepatitis, and the black is for death. It's blunt, as I said, and of course there are thousands of here who died as a consequence of blood contamination who can't be here. What's going to happen today is there will be a commemoration, a film designed by a group of volunteers with some poetry and some photographs and music to convey the scale and gravity of what happened. And then in the afternoon there'll be an opening statement from Sir Brian Langstaff, the chair of the inquiry, and Jenny Richards, QC counsel to the inquiry. And then over the next couple of days there will be statements from the lawyers and core participants themselves, not giving evidence but just giving their opinions on their priorities, their preferred approach to the inquiry. Evidence won't start yet. And of course, for every person there is a story. I've been speaking to a mother who went into labour, went into hospital aged 23, was given a blood transfusion against her will, infected with hepatitis C. She was only diagnosed at the age of 50. She is now 66. Another, she had anemia. She was infected in the 1980s and she was only diagnosed in 2014. So all these people hoping for some answers, and the contamination of blood that killed the thousands and affected countless more. It's been called a tragedy. Many of those gathered here today say it's not a tragedy, it is a scandal, and they want some answers as to how and why it happened.
Thank you, Stephen. That's 5 Live's Stephen Chittenden, who is there. Let's speak to Liz Carroll, who's the Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society. Good morning.
Good morning.
And Andy Evans is a haemophiliac who was infected with HIV as a child. Andy, hi to you.
Good morning.
Andy, just share with us, if you would, your story. You're one of the many people who've been pushing for this for a long time.
Yes, I am, yeah. I'm chair of the campaign group Tainted Blood. But yeah, can I just correct you first on the one point, is the red in the colour scheme stands for HIV. 1,200 people, including myself, were infected with HIV. I was infected at the age of 5 in about 1983. Obviously, that's had quite a profound impact upon my life. I actually developed full-blown AIDS by the time I was 16. And so, you can get an idea of this was a time before the better drugs came out. There was really no kind of prospects, no good prognosis for people with HIV at that time. And then later on, when I did happily manage to survive, as where so many others didn't, unfortunately, we were dropped with the second bombshell of hepatitis C as well, which it actually turned out was the infections for that came around the same time as the HIV, around the late 70s, early 80s, but we weren't told about it until much, much later.
How much more difficult, Andy, has it made things that this was never resolved, it was never looked into, people never really stood up and took responsibility for it?
Well, I think that's a really good point. I think if the government back in the day, the late 80s, when all of this came out in the press, had done the right thing, and it may not have solved the problem as far as saving lives were concerned, but I think if they'd have held their hands up and said, look, we got this terribly wrong, that would have been 30 years less campaigning for a lot of people, including myself. We could have not moved on, but maybe moved around it, taken it with us and tried to make a bit of a life out of what was left. Instead, we've had to fight and fight and fight, to get to this point 30 years later when we can finally say that there is public inquiry on the table starting today.
And Liz, from the Haemophilia Society's point of view, what does this inquiry mean to you?
Well, for us, as Andy put so brilliantly, actually this is 30 years of campaigning alongside the community. This is the chance for the truth to come out about decisions that were made, actions that were either taken or not taken by government, about which treatments were used in the UK for people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders. We know that some of those decisions almost certainly led to more people being infected than ever should have been. And so it's important that the truth comes out, that we're able to understand why and how those decisions were made so that it can never happen again. But it's also important that we make sure that everybody who's lived with this or lost people that they loved from this, that we make sure that the best possible treatments for people are made available today. So if you're living with haemophilia or von Willebrand's disease or HIV or hepatitis C, you need to know that you can have access to the best possible treatment. And money isn't the thing that's going to decide whether you have access to it. And that's part of what needs to come out of what happened in the past, but also for the future.
How do you feel is about the structure of the inquiry, the way it will go? Because it's not a short thing, 2 to 5 years is the time estimate on it. Do you feel confident that it's been set up and structured in a way that will work, that will bring results?
I mean, some of that information we will find out today. So we don't know exactly how the inquiry team plan to go through this process. We have an idea. I think one of the things that is slightly concerning for us is there is so much evidence. If you think about the numbers of people we're talking about, as Andy said, it's almost, 5,000-6,000 people were infected. We've got thousands of people have died. This is the biggest peacetime disaster in the UK. The inquiry team is tiny. One of our concerns at the Society is the inquiry team may not be big enough to deal with the hundreds of thousands of documents going over 30 years. So I really hope that the government put every resource required forward so that people do get the truth and justice that they deserve.
Andy, what do you want to see from this? What will make for you the whole operation feel worthwhile is the wrong word, but will give you some kind of result that you feel reflects everything that's happened?
So I think over the years that we've been campaigning, we've gathered a lot of evidence that things could have been a lot better done, and that decisions were made that have at least exacerbated the number of people that were infected, if not, would have stopped the infections at all. We have a timeline in our heads that we know what happened with all these infections, and we've been pushing to have that put into the public eye for a long time, and now we get the chance to have a judge rubber stamp it. So really what I want out of this inquiry is vindication for all of the years that we've been campaigning and banging on about this and never getting anywhere because people were frightened to come to the press because of the stigma surrounding their infections. So vindication is a very, very important part of it. But also, I think for a lot of people, there is no chance to move on with their lives and make anything of them until we have the final say. Be that what it may, we need a definitive judgment in order to move on from this.
Do you feel, Liz, that something, maybe not exactly the same, but something similar could happen again today? Is that still a concern?
I think it always has to be a concern because in the very, very early days of these infections being found, they were new infections. Nobody really knew what they were. And so there is always potential where as new viruses are found that we need to make sure that they don't get into pooled blood products, which is what people with bleeding disorders have, which is why so many people were infected, because lots of people's donations go into them or into the normal blood systems. There are very, very good close checks made now. Things are tested. There's a lot of care taken, but we always have to be vigilant because actually we don't know for sure until products are tested, people are tested, viruses are discovered, what will happen. So we need to learn the lessons from this about early warning signs, learning from across the world, making decisions that may be very difficult and taking action early, not waiting to see. And I think that is something that we need to ensure comes out in the inquiry too, because actually, as Andy said, we may have been able to stop some infections or make sure people were told of the risks that people were beginning to suspect might have happened. Maybe some partners of men with haemophilia wouldn't have been infected with HIV if they had known there was a risk in the products they had had. We know that wives were infected because families were trying for children because people didn't know that the blood products they'd had were at risk. Those are the sorts of lessons we can learn for the future, and we must.
Andy, purely from a human point of view, really, as you said, you've talked very coolly and very clear-headedly about what you want to see from this. But I imagine after everything you've been through, there'll be moments that'll be incredibly emotional as you hear these stories and finally hear people stand up and say these things.
Yeah, I think at the moment everything is just a little bit surreal. It's 30 years down the line, and the day has finally arrived when we can maybe start the beginning of the journey to put this to bed. And yeah, as I say, it's surreal at the moment, and I've no doubt over the next 3 days it's really going to hit home. All of the people, I'm in Churchill's house at the moment, and all of the people that are here because they're either infected and suffered greatly or because they've lost loved ones. And when the memorial starts in just a little less than 10 minutes, I doubt there'll be a dry eye in the house, and there's going to be a lot of supporting each other going on over the next few days. It's going to be a tough one.
Thank you, Andy. Really appreciate you coming on. Andy Evans and Liz Carroll as well, who's the Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society. You'll be able to hear, of course, more about the opening day of that inquiry on 5 Live throughout the day with Nihal, and also on 5 Live Drive later today from 4 o'clock as well.